Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Westport Library's discussion with Howard Blum on his newest book, The Spy Who Knew Too Much, an ex-CIA officer's quest through a legacy of betrayal. Yes, that's the whole title. You will be able to ask Howard questions using the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen throughout the program, and I'll read them out after our initial discussion. Just so you know, signed copies of The Spy Who Knew Too Much will be available online through 10 p.m. and I will put the link in the chat for you. Or you can go back to the Westport Library calendar listing for it. Howard spoke to us when his last book, Night of the Assassins, was published during the COVID lockdown, and we are lucky to have him back. He is the author of the New York Times bestseller and Edgar Award winner, America Lightning. Blum is a contributing editor at Vanity Fair, and while at the New York Times, he was twice nominated for a Pulitzer Prize for investigative reporting. He's going to be speaking with Maggie Mudd after a short presentation, and you all know her as a former Westport Library trustee and very active in our community. She grew up in big cities around the world and had an international career, principally in banking. And she is the daughter of a career diplomat. So she might know something about spies later on. Without further ado, Howard, I'm going to take myself off the screen to give you more space and so that you can tell us a little bit about the book, and then Maggie will come back in at the end.
Great. Thank you very much. I've been writing books for a while now. At this stage of my career, I could probably fill a shelf, a small shelf, with the number of books I've written. And each book I've learned is its own battle. Each book has its own challenges. And what I'd like to discuss this evening is sort of share with you the insight of how I constructed the narrative scaffolding that would hold The Spy Who Knew Too Much together. Now, I was starting out with what I thought was a pretty good premise. I had this true story about a mole in the CIA and how he was discovered, the revelation of one of the greatest secrets of the Cold War. But I was confronted with the question of how would I tell it? How would I present it to the readers? I knew, as I said, it had to be true. I'm a former New York Times reporter. I have spent many years writing books, and they're all true stories. Every fact is true. Every bit of dialogue is true. There's nothing novel, nothing that's contrived about this. It is all entirely factual. At the same time, I wanted to bring a point of view to the reader. I wanted to be able to present the information in a way that would grab the reader and pull him into my true story. So you have to remember that this book was written in a strange time that we all lived through. It was written during a pandemic. I wrote it in the room you can see here. I'm on a hilltop in Redding, Connecticut, probably not that far from where you are. I'm surrounded by fields, old stone walls. There's a large pond outside. You might even be able to hear the croaking frogs. And it's a pretty isolated place. And during the pandemic, it was even more isolated. My usual involvement in the world was particularly constricted. My writer's life became a very small existence. So each day when I went off to write at my desk, I wanted to bring something exciting, something into the process that would keep me going. And I decided, therefore, to try to make The Spy Who Knew Too Much like a thriller. Also, I like thrillers, to be quite honest. But I wanted to use as my models, my inspirations, the books of Jean le Carré or Ian Fleming. And I wanted to bring that sort of page-turning pulse to a nonfiction story, to a true story. And what le Carré and Ian Fleming always had in their books was someone who could guide the reader through the story. A hero, if you will, someone who a film director would say would show you the POV, the point of view, to get to tell the story. And I quickly focused on the man who would guide the reader through this mole hunt, and his name was Pete Paisley. I like Pete for many reasons, but largely because of his sense of honor and character and his pedigree. He was the son and nephew of admirals. Both his brothers became admirals. There are 7 warships in the US fleet that bear the Paisley name, but Pete had bad eyes and he couldn't get into Annapolis, so he went off to Princeton, joined the Marines, and then the CIA. But he had his family's sense of honor and duty and patriotism, and I like that character, a character with that sort of moral center to guide me through this story where everything was of dubious morality. There's also something else about Pete. He had a very daring career in the CIA. He worked after the Second World War in the back alleys of Europe. He knew where all the bodies were buried, and he probably had even buried some of them. And let me give you an idea of what his daily life was. He was very much involved in an operation that was called the Mozart Express mission. And this mission began when a defector, a KGB major, knocked on the door of the CIA station in Vienna and said he wanted to defect. It was just after the war, and Vienna was a city divided by 4 occupying forces. There were the British, the French, the US, and the Russians. And if you perchance crossed the street and entered into the Russian sector, well, that could become very dangerous. But now this KGB major wanted to defect, and once his bona fides were checked out, he seemed to be the real thing. The question was, how do you get him out of Vienna? You can't really fly him out because he was a high priority defector, and the feeling was that the Russians would shoot down the plane. You couldn't take him through in a car, put him, shove him into the trunk and go through one of the checkpoints because the Russians would open the trunk and they'd start shooting. So Pete came up with this idea to use the Mozart Express. The Mozart Express was a train that moved its way through Vienna from the American section, through the Russian section, and then back into the British section. And so Pete figured he'd hide him on the train. And he had a box made, a big tall box, stamped farm machinery. He figured that was better than top secret. No one would pay attention to farm machinery. And he made the defector, his name was Peter Durobin, fit into the box, and they loaded it onto the train. And Pete sat there with the box. He had a revolver in his pocket, and they're making their way through the American zone. Everything's fine, of course, and they go through the beginnings of the Russian zone, and then the train suddenly comes to a sudden stop. And suddenly a group of Russian soldiers come on board with their rifles out, and they say, "Let me see your papers." You've all seen that scene in all the movies, and Pete has to show them the papers. Meanwhile, he has his revolver still in his pocket, and the Russians start making jokes about this big box marked farm machinery. And they're sort of kicking it and touching it, and they're kicking it harder and harder. And Pete's wondering what the defector inside is going to do. And at the same time, if they start to open the box, he's going to pull out his revolver and he's going to start shooting. But will that start an international incident? Finally, the Russians decide that they were just playing around. They get off the train, and the train makes its way through the Russian sector and into the British sector. And 3 days later, Pete and the defector are in a safe house in Maryland. But this is the sort of world, the daring do world, that Pete was living with. This was how his days were normally spent. And there's something else about a hero of this kind of story that you could see in any spy movie. You look at James Bond, whether he's Sean Connery or Daniel Craig, they're all very dashing, handsome guys. And so was Pete. He had a thatch of thick blonde hair, bright blue eyes, and a toothy grin. There's a picture of him in the front piece of my book, and he's standing there, and he looks like like all the world, like a Ralph Lauren model. He's a very appealing man, and that too made him a good hero for my book. And now, once I had this character who would guide me through the story, there's another element that I saw in all these thrillers that I wanted to bring into my story too. The writers like Le Carre and even Ian Fleming have a catalyst event, something that happens that raises suspicions early on in the story, and it reverberates as the entire story is told. It's something the hero keeps on wondering about where it fits into the plot. And I had a pretty good story, I thought, with Pete. It occurred in the weeks after the Kennedy assassination. At this point, Pete is back in CIA headquarters in Langley, Virginia, and he's working in the Soviet Bloc Division, and the entire Soviet Bloc Division really at this point had one chief priority: to find out what was Lee Harvey Oswald's role in the assassination. Had he been sent by the KGB, because after all, he had lived in Russia as a defector for many years? And if he had been sent on a mission to kill the American president by the KGB, well, the outcome would certainly be World War III. So Pete's looking into this and trying to make sense of this, when suddenly he's summoned by the Geneva station in Switzerland. And they say one of his defectors, that he was running behind the lines in Moscow, one of the spies he'd been working with as a double agent, had now sent a message to the embassy that he was going to appear back in Geneva and he needed a crash meeting. A crisis was at hand. So Pete has 3 days to hightail it to Geneva, and he has to go through the protocols for a crash meeting. The protocols were basically this: you go to the Geneva phone book, you look under the pages of cinemas, you see what's listed at the top of the page alphabetically, and that's where you meet at 7:15 on the 3rd day. So Pete goes to the ABC cinema at 7:15, and there's the man he's supposed to meet. The man's name is Yuri Nisenko. He's a KGB officer. And Pete can't just call out, "Hey, Yuri, let's go off to the safe house," because you don't know who else is watching, if there are other KGB agents. You don't even know if this man is perhaps a triple agent and they're trying to trap Pete. And Pete is also wearing a disguise so that no one on the opposition, none of the KGB agents he might have come across in the past, will recognize him. He's wearing a trilby and a mustache, and he has glasses on, and he now has to get the information to Yuri, who's standing in front of the movie house, about where the safe house is, where they can meet and talk in private. So he decides to execute something that's called a brush pass. This is a bit of tradecraft you learn at spy school, where you walk by someone at a brisk pace. You don't stop, but without breaking stride, you're able to drop a piece of paper into the person's coat pocket. And Pete is able to do this. He walks by Yuri, drops the paper in Yuri's pocket, and keeps on going so no one will notice. And on the paper, though, is the location of the safe house. 20 minutes later, both Yuri and Pete are at the safe house. Yuri is drinking his way through a bottle of single malt scotch paid for by the American taxpayers. And Pete's wondering if he's going to get too drunk to even talk. And Pete tries to take the bottle away, but Yuri is hearing none of that. He's enjoying this good scotch that he doesn't get in Russia. And he finally says, "Let me tell you why I've come, why I've wanted this crash meeting. I know about Lee Harvey Oswald's role with the KGB. I saw his files before he defected into Russia, and I also saw the files on the investigation the KGB conducted after the Kennedy assassination. And I can tell you authoritatively that Oswald was not an agent of the KGB. The KGB did not send him back to the States to kill President Kennedy." And Pete's very excited. This is just the information he wants to hear. This is just the information that can prevent World War III. And then he begins to think, yeah, it's just the information I want to hear. And maybe that's why they're telling it to me. Maybe they're telling me that Oswald was not involved with the KGB for one simple reason. He was. And if he was, that means the KGB was behind the assassination of an American president. And that means that World War III is looming. So Pete immediately doesn't have the answers. This is sort of the world he lives in. It's been called a wilderness of mirrors. And it's very difficult to figure out who is telling you the truth and who is telling you lies. But he knows one thing for sure. He has to bring Yuri back to the United States and debrief him, perhaps even present him to the Warren Commission. So Pete brings Yuri back to the United States, and they begin a period of interrogation. They have a safe house in the Virginia horse country where Yuri is kept, and it's a very pleasant interrogation. But as the days, weeks pass, Pete becomes suspicious. He believes that Yuri is not telling him the truth, that Yuri really is making up stories and doesn't really know Oswald that well, or Oswald's file either. And he's wondering, why is he telling me this? And Pete discusses it with the other members, the other chief officers of the Soviet division, and they decide something has to be done. But first they want to lull Yuri. They don't want Yuri to be too suspicious that they might be onto him, that he's really a false defector. So they send Yuri off to Hawaii. They give him a redheaded prostitute for company that is paid for by you and me, the American taxpayers, and they let him lull in the sun for about a week. And then when he comes back to Washington, that's when the harsh interrogation begins. They eventually wind up putting Yuri in a 12-foot by 12-foot cell. Other people call it a 12-foot by 12-foot box. It's very much a Guantanamo Bay interrogation. But after 2 years of this intense interrogation, here's the thing. Yuri doesn't crack. He doesn't tell Pete that he's a phony defector. Pete, however, is convinced that he's lying. But other people within the CIA, other officers, other executives, think Yuri's telling the truth, and they eventually win out. Yuri is liberated from his 12-foot by 12-foot box. He's given a check for $75,000 for his troubles, and he's put on the CIA payroll. And he even lectures CIA officers. And for that moment, existing right up till today, there's a split between two sides in the Central Intelligence Agency. One side believes in the master plot. This group of CIA officers believe that Yuri and others like him, both in the past and even today, have been sent over as false defectors to worm their way into the agency to spread disinformation. The other side in the agency believes this is total paranoia, that these CIA officers are seeing things that aren't there, and they call it the monster plot. And to this day, while we're fighting a de facto hot war in the Ukraine, the CIA is still divided into these two camps about whether or not there are these phony defectors spreading this information and taking out secrets and feeding them into Russia. Another aspect of a spy story I saw as I read through, the models I was looking at, the Le Carré and the Ian Fleming models, is that there needs to be a bit of romance. I didn't have the romance in Pete's life. He was, fortunately for him, a very happily married man, but the romance involves his daughter. You see, his daughter was also a CIA officer. And remember Peter Deribin, that man who was smuggled out, the defector in the box marked farm machinery? Well, once he got back to America and they let him out of his box, he became an analyst for the CIA. And he also became a matchmaker. He became a Cupid of sorts. He set up a dinner party where Pete's daughter, a CIA officer, could meet the son of another CIA officer, and this son too was also working for one of the American intelligence services. And these two young fledgling spies hit it off. They wound up within 8 months getting married, and it was a marriage that united two of the most famous and well-entrenched families in American espionage history, the Bagleys and the Rocas. And this romance and this marriage set up by a Russian defector sort of weaves its way also through my book. And there's another element that should be in a good spy story, a mystery, something that the hero sets off to solve, like a George Smiley, Le Carre's character, or even a sort of Sherlock Holmes. It's a mystery that sets the entire book into motion, something that perplexes him and that he needs to solve. And I felt, a pretty good one here. It began in October 1978. On that day, on the Chesapeake Bay, a bright autumn morning, a sailboat goes aground. The Coast Guard investigates. They go on board. They see 9mm bullets scattered on the deck. They go down into the galley, and there are papers stamped top secret, property of the CIA. And there's also an electronic device that's later identified as a classified burst transmitter. This is a device used for communicating with satellites. But there's no sign of the boat's owner, John Paisley, a high-ranking CIA official. 10 days later, a body, despite being wrapped in 36 pounds of chains, surfaces to the top of the Chesapeake Bay. The CIA gets the body. They notice a bullet hole behind the left ear, and they say it's suicide, and they immediately say it's John Paisley, and they quickly have the body cremated. But is it? Is this Paisley's body? And if it's not Paisley's, then whose is it? Well, there are a lot of questions being raised, and Pete begins to ask these questions. For starters, he asks, how can this be Paisley's? The first thing he would do is check the fingerprints. Every CIA official has their fingerprints taken, and they're on file in the CIA computers. Only problem is that the CIA says we can't find Paisley's fingerprints. They're the one set of fingerprints that seems to be missing. I used to try that in high school, say the dog ate my homework. But here's the CIA now trying to use that sort of odd excuse. Also, the body that's found that's totally unrecognizable after it's 10 days in the water is 5'4". Paisley, according to his military records, was 5'11". Could he have shrunk that much? And the underwear on the body that's found in the water is size 32. The underwear in Paisley's apartment is size 36. Doesn't seem to make much sense. But then there's also the CIA's explanation of how Paisley committed suicide. The way they explain it, he got on the deck of the sailboat, wrapped himself up like a mummy in these 36 pounds of chains, then trundled over to the side of the boat. He had the gun in his right hand because he was right-handed, and then with a colossal effort, he hurled himself off the side of the boat, and while in midair, he reached across his body, despite the chains, and shot himself behind his left ear, his arm crossing his body. Well, that's a pretty nimble explanation, and Paisley would have to be pretty nimble to pull it off. Didn't make sense to Pete. And he begins an investigation to find out what happened. To get to the bottom of things, he has to touch base with really all the other elements that I've mentioned before, with Pete Darabin, the defector who he smuggled out in the box, with his daughter who got married because of Darabin, with Nosenko, and how the Nosenko case fits into this other mystery. And he puts all these pieces together. And as he puts these pieces together, where does it lead? This is the final element that my story needs, that every good story needs. You need a payoff. The mystery sort of has to be solved. And on a snowy day in 2007 in Moscow, outside a cemetery just outside the city limits in Moscow, Pete gets the answer to the entire mystery, and he's able to put all these pieces of the puzzle together. And so when I finally had all these elements and I was able to juggle them and see how they would fit, I sat down at this desk I'm right at now, and I began to write, and I began to type out my first sentence. And I wrote, two deaths, each purportedly a suicide, each with its roots deep in the secret world, each with its own perplexing mysteries, wrenched Pete Bagley, retired and somewhat besmirched spy, from the complacency of his pleasant exile and set him on the twisting path back to the shadowy battlefields of his previous life. What I wrote next, how I put all the pieces together, well, perhaps you'll read the book and find out. And so I thank you for listening. And if Maggie wants to chime in now, I'm ready to hear what she has to say and discuss what she has and to answer any of your questions later on. Thank you.
Thank you, Howard. I have to say, this story has the makings of a wonderful miniseries.
From your mouth to Hollywood's ears.
It really does. The mystery part is, I just find completely astonishing. And my first thought was about the boat ending up as it did on Point Lookout. Well, that's right there by the Soviet compound.
Yes.
The compound that Obama closed down because of the Russian interference in our elections in 2016.
Yes, and that compound is a beautiful building. It was built by an industrialist in the early 1900s, and the Soviets got it after he defaulted on a mortgage. It was a beautiful bit of property. I don't know what Obama has done with it, what we've done with it since, but you're right. It was right in the area, and there was also a lot of message traffic that night going on that the Coast Guard also picked up.
You say in the book, which was really, I literally like, I went like this when you said those two things, that there was an unusual amount of traffic emanating from that compound. And there was a Polish trawler that at midnight was going through the Chesapeake from Baltimore on its way to Rotterdam. And now, how did you find out about that as a possibility for what then unfolds? How did you?
Well, the question you ask is sort of, how do I get the information for this? A lot of this is from declassified CIA documents. There also was a congressional investigation that revealed the trawler, the existence of the trawler going through the passageway. Congress found that out. But how was I able to get the pieces? You know, CIA officials don't want to talk. And let me tell you, it was really hard. One of the things I've done, I was a Times reporter for many years, and as I said, I've written many books about, not many, but at least 10, about the intelligence community. And so I've developed some sources. And it was sources in the intelligence community who first told me about Paisley's strange death. And they were able to put some of the pieces together, but also talking to them, interviewing these sources during a pandemic was also difficult. People often ask me, were you scared at any point during your investigations? And I usually say the only thing I'm scared about is missing a deadline. But on this story, I was scared. Let me tell you why. Here it was, the beginning of the pandemic. There was no such thing as vaccines. No one even imagined that they'd have vaccines at any time. And I had to meet a group of intelligence officials down at a place in the Beltway. So rather than get on a plane or a train, I drove down from Connecticut, got there in time, and I go to where they want to meet. And it's a conference room without windows, and these macho guys, never heard of masks and certainly wouldn't put on a mask, something as silly as a feat as that. And I'm sitting there with them, and I couldn't wear a mask, and we're in this windowless room. That scared me. That was the scariest thing I've actually had to do while researching a book. But I was able to get the information, and so far I've survived.
Well, now there's so many points that you raise about Paisley that just, I don't know, I just was incredulous. Like the fact that he did not have a polygraph test for 25 years. I thought
that is incredible, and it's so amazing. And as an American citizen, as an American taxpayer, anyone who cares about the security of our nation, the fact that the CIA would let a high-ranking official go through all those years without checking up on a polygraph test. It's supposed to be done every year. It's usually done within 2 years if you speak to people in the agency. But someone at that level would have gone 25 years without it. And as soon as he was called for a polygraph test, it was just a matter of days later that the strange event happens on the Chesapeake Bay where he seems to disappear or commit suicide.
Well, also his outrageous behavior, sexually risky behavior, which he's doing in tandem with another Czech defector and his wife. Wouldn't this raise red flags with CIA staff who are looking at the emotional health of their operatives?
You're raising very important, very intelligent, very insightful questions. And the answer is, you're 100% right, but it didn't happen. And that's really incredible. And so when you think, this is a story about the past, but it's also a story about a continuum of treason. The fact that the Soviets infiltrated people into the agency in the past makes it very probable that they're doing it today, especially when you have Putin, an ex-KGB man, running Russia today. You see how aggressive he's been in our elections. You see he's sent agents to kill people in Britain, and we see he's actually started a war. And so the idea that he would put an end to trying to penetrate our intelligence agencies seems to me absurd, and that we're being so lax is very frightening. I think that's one of the messages I'd like people to take away, as you so perceptively did, about the story I tell. While it's a thriller and a true story, it's the true part that perhaps is the most shocking, because these sorts of laxities are taking place in our intelligence service.
I guess for me, the most shocking, is that me doing that? For me, the most shocking thing was his taking up residence after he separates from his wife at 1500 Massachusetts Avenue. And he's right down the hall from a whole cluster of Soviet agents, these so-called night crawlers, who are out every night looking for US government employees to trap in compromising positions at gay bars or with lonely men with women, so forth. And that he does that. We know these people are on that same floor, and they're being managed by this guy Vitaly Yurchenko in the Soviet embassy. I mean, that doesn't cause the whole thing to fall apart, and for him to be.
It's incredible. It's also perfect cover. In this, the FBI, which is monitoring the building, taking pictures of anyone who enters, they see Yurchenko entering from the Soviet embassy, and they think he's meeting the night crawlers, those sort of Soviet assets who go combing the bars for traders. But he's really meeting with Paisley, and so they can meet in plain sight. And the FBI has the pictures, but they don't put two and two together. It's really very smart of the Russians.
So one of the things you quote vaguely as saying that, or maybe it was something that he said in the book that he subsequently wrote, that you quote from, Spy Wars, that every traitor uncovered inside intelligence services, East or West, during the Cold War was caught only because of tips from sources inside the enemy's camp. So it takes a mole to catch a mole. That
Right.
it's not great spycraft on the part of either the Soviets or us. It's actually that somebody within their own organization has tipped.
Right. And there's a corollary to that. You talk about great spy handlers who recruit spies
Right.
to betray their country. Well, it's not really hard work to recruit them, because the only people you recruit are people who are willing or ready. They're looking to betray their country. They either want the money or the fame or to be an actor on the world stage. It's as long as there are people involved, human people, not machines involved in intelligence work, there will be traitors. That's just a fact of life. And therefore, our counterintelligence services have to be always working. And the fact that they're so lax at this present moment is distressing.
Well, what do you think in your own experience exploring these topics about the state of human intelligence? Because of course, during this period of time that you depict, most spycraft was conducted through human intelligence. We didn't have the sophisticated satellites that we have today, where you can see the type of shoe that the opponent is wearing in a mountain in Afghanistan or whatever. Yeah. What do you think is the state of, I mean, for example, we were always bemoaning the fact that we don't have human intelligence about Iran because we haven't had relations with Iran since 1979. And I think we have a listening post in Dubai or someplace, but where we have people who are talking to the expatriates.
I mean, our human intelligence, or human as it's called, is in a very sorry state. We have to, in Iran, rely on the Israelis. They're able to have agents who have been able to make their way into Iran, to penetrate into Iran. Our electronic intelligence is very sophisticated. The CIA has just had a tremendous victory with electronic intelligence. We were able to accurately predict that Russia would invade the Ukraine. But for people on the ground in the Ukraine, we're relying on the British. It's the British agents there who are giving the information, and we just don't have those kind of resources. It's lacking. We're lacking in counterintelligence and lacking in penetration agents in enemy countries.
All these events that you depict were happening around the time that a lot of attention was being put on the CIA in the aftermath of Watergate, and with revelations that the CIA was spying on domestic persons, students who were opposing the war in Vietnam and so forth. And we had all those committees. We had the Church Committee, the Pike Committee, and all those committees. And William Colby tried to make an opening, tried to make the goings on of the CIA more better known to the public and so forth. But it seems like the culture at the CIA is, I don't know if it's still the case, but there was a very specific culture obtaining then. All the leaders came out of the same world experience in the aftermath of the Second World War, where the fight was anti-communism. And of course, China wasn't a player at this time. It was just the Soviets that we were in a deadly duel with. And there was, it seems to me that that what we're talking about is a culture of self-preservation that really had a very, very hard time coming to grips with failures.
Well, you make a key point. I mean, the CIA is very much afraid of embarrassment. And that's, they don't want to be exposed as they're false. I mean, no one wants to have your false exposed, but the CIA goes to the extent that they don't have aggressive counterintelligence. They're not eager to look for moles because they don't want to find them there. They want to believe this was all something about the past rather than something that's going on this day. When you talk about the church committees and the revelations about the CIA, at that same time, Russia, the KGB, was running, according to files that have been previously released, 38 different people in various intelligence agencies, whether these were in the FBI or the DIA and the CIA is not known, but they had these 38 traitors passing them information, and we didn't find them. And we focused more on that bit of embarrassment, the church committee, rather than the way our intelligence agencies have been penetrated. And as you point out very shrewdly, that is the culture that exists today.
Yeah. And it's fine. And this whole story is echoed in the Aldrich Ames case and the Robert Hansen case. I mean, seems very similar.
Yes, it's a continuum of treason. I mean, it's the same programs.
Well, so do you know what happened to the Romeo and Juliet couple, Roca's son and Bagley's daughter? Are they still married? Are they still in the life?
They have a son who's just got out of NYU, and they're both. She goes on to the State Department after a while, and her her husband stays in the Defense Intelligence Agency, and yeah, they're both now retired.
Wow.
Have distinguished careers.
The breakdown of opposing sides in the CIA kind of broke down, didn't it? Of those who believed in Tonoseenko and those who believed in Golitsyn, the agent that defected just a month before Tonoseenko did, right?
You're right. Golitsyn is sort of the key. Golitsyn is a defector who's taken on by Angleton and the people who believe in the master plot, Pete Paisley. He provides information that says after he's defected, the Soviets are going to send someone over to debunk me, to say everything I said is wrong. And lo and behold, there comes Yuri Tonoseenko. So it seemed that he was accurate. But to this day, there are those who believe that Golitsyn was telling invented stories. And it seems quite possible that towards the end of Golitsyn's career, he didn't fabricate. After he ran out of real stories to tell about the KGB, he did invent them. But he was accurate about something called Section 13. That is a division of the KGB and now the new Russian intelligence services. The names keep changing, but their letters change, but they're still the same. That's involved in sending disinformation and sending phony defectors here to this country to spread this disinformation.
Yeah. So it used to be that there was kind of an unwritten code of behavior between the CIA and the KGB that they didn't kill each other's operatives. Do you think that still holds? I mean, it doesn't seem that it does.
They usually don't kill operatives who are under diplomatic cover, but anyone who's an illegal, who's not posing as a diplomat, who's working under cover, kind of like in the show you saw, The Americans, those are the people who are really risking their lives.
So Pete Paisley, he retires in like 1974 or something like that, right?
Yes.
And so he has this story inside of him that he wants to solve for 30 years.
It's an Ahab-like quest. That's what makes him, to me, so fascinating. And a patriot. I mean, he's living this very comfortable life in Brussels with his pension, happily married. His children are growing up. Not a care in the world. He has many interests. He's a bird watcher. He cares about Shakespeare, history. He tries to be a businessman. But as a patriot, he realizes something is wrong and he's pulled back in. And that's why, to me, he's a real American hero. He's doing this not so much for himself, but for the good of the country.
It's interesting that he chose to retire overseas.
Yes, well, his wife was from Austria and had a very comfortable life there. Uh, and he was Brussels station chief for 4 years before that. And so he liked that world. And there was also the feeling if you came back to America, it was a time of uprest. You can take your children, work at, and live in Chevy Chase or somewhere in the Beltway, and no matter what school you're sending them to, it was a dangerous time for kids. He thought they might be better off going to school in Europe.
No. Another part of this story that I just found astonishing was that Paisley sailed that boat of his all the way down to North Carolina to visit Nosenko.
Yeah.
And he spent weeks at a time with him.
Yeah.
Holy smoke.
I mean, it's incredible. And that the CIA didn't try to get transcripts, or maybe there are transcripts. Maybe they bugged Nosenko's house, and maybe sitting in some file somewhere are the actual transcripts of what the two said to one another. I'd like to see that.
Now, what happened to Nosenko, which really, I mean, troubled a lot of people in the CIA. They thought many of them thought it was abomination how he was kept the way he was.
It was brutal. It was Guantanamo Bay, a precursor of that. And Pete Paisley has a responsibility for that sort of handling of Nosenko. But again, just like his obsessiveness to stay with this for 30 years, he was determined to get to the bottom of it. If it may be playing fast and loose with regular judicial procedure, he was willing to do that. And that's something his reputation is tainted with.
Yeah. Well, that's not allowed today. This wouldn't be permitted today. That's why we have those black ops sites elsewhere, right?
Right. Well, but it's permitted just elsewhere rather than not on CIA domestic territory. Yeah.
We've
So I don't know if we've become more sophisticated or more legalistic. I don't think we've become more moral.
Yeah. And what do you think about the posture of Angleton in all this, who was the head of CIA counterintelligence? I mean, he had been so disastrously wrong about Kim Philby. Do you think that that was why he really never believed in any of these defectors?
No, I don't. I think that's perhaps been exaggerated. I think Angleton is a character in CIA history who's more sinned against than sinning. Yes, there were excesses, but I think he ran a counterintelligence service where he was able to track down the moles. He missed with Philby, and he lived with that forever. But I don't think he's the villain in all this. I don't think he was paranoid. As I say, and Bagley says, he's more sinned against than sinning.
The time is flying by, and we have questions. So I have to yield to the audience.
Okay, terrific. Lovely speaking with you. Thank you so much, Maggie.
Yes, thank you. And everybody buy the book. It's really great.
Thank you again.
Yes.
Okay, so I'm gonna mute myself.
Okay. Thank you, Maggie. So Howard, we do have some questions from the audience. So I'm going to start with the first one that came in, and we'll just go through all of them. How's that?
Sounds good to me. I'll try to come up with answers. Okay.
Marta says she's not involved with the world of spies, but she would live it vicariously. And she asks, is your opinion after your research, how much do you think can the CIA director change the culture of the organization?
I think the CIA director can have a very dramatic change on the culture of the organization, for good or bad. I mean, Colby changed it one way. They shocked a lot of people in the CIA. The whole Guantanamo Bay that we were talking about is a CIA director who's directly involved in Guantanamo Bay activities and black ops. So I think the CIA director is very, very important.
Mm. What type of control does the CIA have on what you're allowed to write?
Well, as a reporter, it's you don't want to give away state secrets, but you want to get the story. So I had done a small example. I had done a piece for the New York Times just about a year ago, an investigation of a man who was a con man who was stealing money from the black intelligence budgets, and he was roping in real people involved in the intelligence community. And just before we're going to go to press at the Times, I call up the CIA and I say, I'm going to mention the name of one of your serving agents, and I want to know if you're okay with that. And I said, let me give you his name. And they said, I don't want to hear the name. You write whatever you want to do. It's okay with us. So fine. 10:30 that night, my phone rings. We'd appreciate it if you don't put that man's name in the story. We now know who you're going to put in, so leave it out. And of course, I left it out because you don't want to put someone's name in jeopardy. And you also now had a chip that perhaps you could cash in somewhere down the road and getting cooperation from the CIA. So that's how you go about putting a story together.
Oh, wow. Okay, so Eric wants to know, what kind of emotional and psychological struggles did you find that spies experience? And did you incorporate any of that into this book at all?
Well, it's a good question, and I'd like to think I incorporated all my characters have that living with a world of, as has been called, the wilderness of mirrors, where you don't know what's true or false. You know, Le Carré has this line, betrayal is a very repetitious trade, and he talks about someone starting to lie as a schoolboy and winding up a stealer of secrets and betraying his country. And they're all living in these two worlds. And the key to it, to make it work for them, for a trader, is you each master you're serving, the government you're working for and the government you're betraying, you want to do a good job for both of them. That's sort of the bifurcated calculus in this sort of type of betrayal. If you're an American CIA agent, you want to be good at that job, what you're doing for the CIA, and at the same time, you want to, after you've accomplished your missions, if you're a trader, you're selling your mission, you're selling your secrets to the CIA, to Russia too. And you can see John Paisley working in this way. He was very good at his job at the CIA. He moved up in the organization because of what he accomplished. But at the same time, while he was doing real valuable work for the CIA, he was also passing on other information to the KGB.
Okay.
Can I just ask you, just intervene there? What do you think his motivation was?
It's really difficult to talk about the motivation of anyone's motivation, but he's particularly hard because he lives on so many different levels. You know, one way he portrays himself as a loyal CIA agent, then he's betraying them. He's a loyal husband, but betraying his wife. He's betraying his girlfriend. He's betraying everyone. So I think he's a man who's totally at odds with everything, and he's just pretty opportunistic and wants to live this exciting life. He wants to be. I said I want the character in my book to seem like a James Bond sort of character. Well, he's playing that too. He's trying to elevate his life into something more artful, something more dramatic, to give him the thrills he needs. That perhaps also explains his involvement in this world of sex clubs in Washington and Virginia.
Yeah.
So here's another one. In your writing, you would have to make some judgments about what you bring in or not. And how do you resolve the moral judgments of that? Do you have an editor that you talk to? Does the CIA help you at all? You already sort of answered that. How do you decide which parts to put in and not?
Well, it's a very good question, and it's a dilemma. My first goal is to tell the story as accurately as possible. And I try to gather as much information as I can that will allow the reader to know everything that happens. At the same time, it's impossible to get everything. Well, doing this book, I spoke with a CIA official, and I went to Langley, and I'm in an office there, and I tell him, the pompous reporter, I want this to be a true story. And he immediately starts to laugh. And what are you laughing at? And he says, well, it's impossible for it to be a true story because there's always one more file. There's one more file that I can't get, and there's always one more file that you certainly can't get. All you can aspire to is try to get it as true as possible. And that's what I try to do. I try to get it as true as possible without putting anyone's life in danger. That's sort of the rubric I work under.
Okay, so that sort of leads us to the next question, which is, with all the intelligence available to everyone these days, how do today's spies separate the truth from the lies?
It's pretty difficult. I mean, a spy's job at many levels is not to separate the truth from the lies. The spy's job is to get the information, then you pass it on to the analysts who use it, and they make the decisions based on that. A spy is, you have to assume that if anything you get from Russia, for example, could very well be false. Disinformation is part of the project, and that's something you have to deal with. It's particularly true when you have a walk-in. A walk-in is someone who comes up to you and says, I want to defect and give you secrets. Well, this could be the greatest treasure ever, or he could come here to give you disinformation that will lead you down alleys and into dead ends. You don't know. As I said, it's this wilderness of mirrors, and you just have to make judgments. And that's something too a reporter has to do. When someone comes to you information, you have to really just make an instinctive, intuitive value judgment. Is this the real thing? And this is valuable for me to explore, or am I going off on a dead end, on a tangent?
Okay, so the final question at this point is, so what do you think is the real Soviet Lee Harvey Oswald story?
Well, first, Maggie had mentioned Angleton, James Angleton, the CIA counterintelligence chief. He never said that Oswald was working for the Russians, but if you never received that much publicity, but he was convinced that Oswald had a relationship, an ongoing relationship with the Russians. And that's the great question that'll be like UFOs or whatever, they'll be someday solved. What do I think? I think the Warren Commission was pretty accurate that Oswald was a lone gunman. I think an interesting element is what he did in Mexico City, who he talked with there when he went down there, and what we knew about it. Those are the elements. Those are three different parts of the story. But again, this is an atom that's still waiting to be split. There's a lot we don't know even after all this time. There's a lot of declassified files. I go back to the CIA man telling me there's always one file beyond your reach. And this is an event where certainly there is one, maybe even two files beyond my reach or your reach or anyone's reach at this point.
Thank you so much, Howard and Maggie,
Thank you.
for bringing The Spy Who Knew Too Much to us. And as Maggie said, you should purchase the book.
I'll say that too.
Yes. Okay. All three of us say The Spy Who Knew Too Much, an ex-CIA officer's quest through a legacy of betrayal. You can get a signed copy through 10 p.m. this evening through the library's website. I have already put the link in the chat for you if you wanted to copy that out now. And we will get them signed for you. And we do also have a copy of the book in the library if you want to take it out and, forgive me for saying it, not pay for it. Sometimes that's okay too. This is also a great way to join out the Westport Library's Summer Reading Challenge. This book covers read a book by an author who visits the library. And even though we're not in the library right now, this book counts. I made sure of it. So
Good.
join the summer reading challenge, read The Spy Who Knew Too Much, and Howard and Maggie, thank you both so much for your time this evening. And thank you all so
And
much.
thank you, Maggie, very much. I appreciate it.
It was a great
That was
pleasure.
impressive.
It was a great
Okay.
pleasure talking to you. And I
Thank
really
you.
enjoyed reading the book. By the way, I ordered Begley's book to read. I ordered all the books which are in your bibliography.
Great. Thank you so
Great.
much. Have a good evening.
All right.
Bye-bye.
Thank you all. Good
Bye-bye.
night.